it's so difficult trying to work out what the purpose of life is when you don't feel joy, excitement, pleasure, all the positive emotions that other people do, when life is kind of a series of events that happen, because there's a lot of shame in that. When I think back to my wedding day and think, I was masking and saying, oh, this is the happiest day of my life, whereas inside I just felt nothing.
Hello and welcome to Crisis What Crisis, the podcast that shows you how to navigate life's toughest moments with the people who've lived them, learned from them and come back stronger. I'm Andy Coulson, and if you've been through a crisis or just want to be better prepared for life's inevitable difficulties, these conversations are here to offer lessons, insights and reassurance that recovery is always possible. My guest today is the scientist turned ADHD advocate, podcaster, author and charity founder, James Brown. Diagnosed at 45, James's life was for decades shaped by a condition he didn't even know he had. A hyperactive child dismissed by doctors, a gifted academic quietly drowning in burnout, a man who spent Christmas Day in 2020 in silence, contemplating the end of his life.
So it was at that point, on that Christmas Day, that I realised, okay, I'm going to get help. And that's a big thing, Andy, to go from I don't deserve help, I'm a burden, to actually I deserve help and I want to have a future. And that switch from there's no future to I'm just going to explore if there is one was massive.
That moment was the breaking point. Within weeks, James received an ADHD diagnosis and began the long process of reframing his life. The result has been extraordinary. He's since co-founded the charity ADHD Adult UK, launched the very successful podcast, The ADHD Adults, with his wife, Sam Brown, and best friend, Alex Connor, and become one of the UK's most prominent voices on adult neurodivergence. Earlier this year, Alex and James published a book, ADHD Unpacked, Everything You Need to Know to Survive and Thrive as an Adult with ADHD. But this is not a story of neat redemption. James's life with cyclothymia, binge-eating disorder, and chronic anhedonia, the inability to feel joy, are also struggles that he has to navigate on a daily basis. What makes James such a compelling guest is not just the advocacy, the education, and the science, it's the honesty, the refusal to polish the pain or hide how he's feeling. James Brown, welcome to Crisis What Crisis, and how are you, sir?
Hi, Andy. I'm good today. How are you?
I'm extremely well, thank you very much. I'm sorry not to be with you in the studio. COVID has got in the way, but a mild dose. I think it's very important that we start by defining ADHD, if that's okay. A bit of a basic question for someone who lives with it and is sort of within the ADHD universe in such an important role. But I think it will help provide a sort of useful lens at the start of the conversation. If you can just give us your definition, and not just of the ADHD, but also of the other conditions that you have to live with.
So ADHD is really complicated, and most people have this slightly stereotypical view of naughty boys running around at school, being behaviourally challenging. What it actually is a largely genetic, lifelong neurodevelopmental condition. What that means is in the early years of life, because of our genetics and some environmental events, the brain just develops fractionally differently. And that leads to behavioural differences, which could be issues with focus and attention, issues with impulsivity and hyperactivity, issues with motivation, and issues with regulating our emotions. And one of the most important things I think to understand about ADHD is it's called a neurodivergence because our brains work slightly differently, but we're diverse as a neurodivergent group. So we don't all have exactly the same strengths and challenges and traits and symptoms. We're a really mixed bunch that have, to some extent, a lot of shared experience. And for those of us that are late diagnosed, that shared experience is often years and years of just thinking that we're less, we're worse, that we're rubbish, we're unreliable, that we're flaky. And therefore the power of a diagnosis is that it gives you that lens to look at your life and realise that there's a reason that all those things happened. It wasn't down to me choosing to do things or not do things. My brain often directed me to do things in that way. The other issues, because I do tend to collect diagnoses. We have a league table in my family. I'm second, by the way. And the other one I think is worth mentioning most is probably cyclothymia, which is a form of bipolar disorder. So that means it's a rapidly cycling lack of mood stability. So every couple of months, it's 2 weeks of severely low mood, and then every maybe once or twice a year hypomanic episodes of just kind of, well, for somebody that's anhedonic, feeling happy and wanting to speak to people and wanting to do everything, but that turns into 3 or 4 days of not sleeping and using drugs and behaviours that start to become out of my control. So those are the two things diagnostically that kind of define me. But the one thing you mentioned, which is probably the most important thing, and that's the anhedonia. It's so difficult trying to work out what the purpose of life is when you don't feel joy, excitement, pleasure, all the positive emotions that other people do, when life is kind of a series of events that happen, because there's a lot of shame in that. When I think back to my wedding day and think, I was masking and saying, oh, this is the happiest day of my life, whereas inside I just felt nothing. No emotion at all. It was nice to see lots of family and friends. It was nice, weirdly, it was on television. It was nice to have this really odd wedding that was televised, but to not have that sense of joy is what probably defines me now as somebody that experiences life through a slightly different lens.
What about contentment? With that mix of diagnosis, are you able to feel content?
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually. If anyone kind of Googles the feelings wheel or the wheel of emotions, you can see the full wheel of emotions that we feel, which are positive or negative. And looking at the positive ones, contentment is probably one that I can feel. The challenge is that one of the complicating factors of ADHD, which we also see in the autistic community, is something called alexithymia, and that's challenges with naming and understanding our emotions. So sometimes when I probably feel content, I don't really know what I'm feeling. And to me, contentness is the absence of all the negative stuff. If I'm not feeling anxious, if I'm not feeling afraid, if I'm not feeling stressed, then that to me isn't neutral. It's content. So I probably do feel contentment more than I acknowledge. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's enough for me to realise that maybe that's my happy, and I need to just readjust my lens. But that's probably the one positive emotion that I can feel semi-regularly.
One thing I hadn't appreciated at all until I started, frankly, till I started preparing for our conversation, and been reading, listening to your work, but I had no idea that ADHD had been sort of recognised as a diagnosis for as long as it had. The issue is that the UK, it seems, and I don't know whether that spreads across other countries as well, but I've heard you talk about it in the context of the UK. We're just so late in coming to any degree of understanding here. But the Germans in particular were well ahead of the curve on this, right?
They did. I mean, there was children's books, a series of children's books called Fidgety Phil that were published in the 19th century, like before any medical text in the UK. In the UK, the NHS kind of changed their diagnostic framework from the year 2000 so children could be diagnosed with ADHD. And it was only from the year 2008 that adults could be diagnosed with ADHD. And then to kind of make things even worse, it wasn't until 2013 that you could get a diagnosis of ADHD and autism. Before then, they were mutually exclusive. If you had a diagnosis of one, you couldn't be diagnosed with the other, and yet we know around 60% of autistic people probably also have ADHD, and around 25% of people probably are also autistic. And you're absolutely right to mention Germany, because this isn't something that the scientific community has not known about. The first British medical publication was 1902. So George Still, who at the time called it, and this may be where the stigma started, an abnormal defect of moral control in children. So imagine being told, I'm sorry, Mrs. Brown, but your son has an abnormal defect of moral control. And that was 1902. But in 1775, a German doctor called Melchior Weikart published a book called Attention Deficit, in which they described perfectly the symptoms of ADHD. And you can go back probably with a little bit of cynicism to 350 BCE, when a Greek doctor called Theophrastus wrote a series of books called Characters, and one of them was called The Obtuse Man. And some scientists looked at the description of that patient, and it fit the diagnostic criteria for ADHD in 350 BCE. So we've known that, if you like, the manifestation of the symptoms to the point where they would be diagnosed today have been with us probably for the entirety of humanity.
Goodness. So what does it say about our systems in the UK then, that it's taken us till 2020 to get to any kind of any grip? Perhaps it says something about the sort of British institutional state of mind as well. I don't know.
We do have. There are positives and negatives to this. We have a very high bar for evidence within NICE, the NHS's evidence body, and therefore it often takes a lot of time to build evidence that NICE is happy with to say, yes, okay, this is a diagnosis or this is a treatment. But the problem is, most of the tests and the frameworks that we've got are based around the American Psychiatric Association's diagnostic manual, and the tests in there, frankly, aren't very good. So they were developed particularly for ADHD by looking at white cisgendered boys with ADHD and saying, right, what do they do? Okay, let's get a test to measure what they do. So it automatically discriminates against, non-white, non-cisgendered, non-boys. And we have this huge waiting period where there's evidence in other countries which has turned into medical practice, which then just seems to take sometimes decades to translate itself into medical frameworks and support and diagnostic pathways and treatments. In the UK, where we are with ADHD, you're probably around my age, Andy, and I'm sure you can remember back in the 90s, yuppie flu, and everyone was saying,
I'm a little bit older than you, James.
Well, you don't look it. Well, you've made a deal with somebody to have hair that looks that good, Andy. I can remember in the 90s, yuppie flu. Oh, it's young people making excuses. They're lazy. They just don't go to work. And we now know that is chronic fatigue syndrome. It's a well-documented clinical framework. Where we are with ADHD is where we were with chronic fatigue syndrome back in the 90s, that most people in society either don't think it's real or think that, we're all a bit ADHD. And even psychiatrists I've spoken to in the last couple of years have said things like, it's very trendy nowadays, isn't it? Or, for example, I had somebody I assessed recently, and they didn't get a diagnosis because whilst it seemed they had the symptoms, they had a really successful career. And those are the people doing the assessments. And obviously not all of them have those opinions and those practices, but there is this deeply ingrained systemic and societal resistance to accepting that ADHD is real. Lots of us have it, and it's very impactful.
And you're optimistic. I use that word with caution, given what you said about your emotions, but you feel some optimism in terms of the direction of travel on this now. I mean, there are issues as well that I want to discuss. There are people that perhaps are abusing a diagnosis or that are causing a strain on the system by, kind of misusing an ADHD self-diagnosis. Maybe I'm interested to talk about that. But overall, you are optimistic.
I'd say yes with a small y. I think that things will probably get worse before they get better because the increased pressure on the NHS. Now we've got somewhere between 3 and 5% of all adults have ADHD. So that's around 2.5 million people in the UK, and only 1 in 9 have a diagnosis. So the reason that we're seeing now lots of people seeking an assessment is we've got this huge army of people who've suddenly heard about ADHD, maybe had a relative, a child diagnosed, and because it's genetic, it often runs in families. And therefore, when people find out that, that's what ADHD is, and start to realise this is something they've lived with, they obviously want help. And the NHS isn't resourced for this at all. It hasn't had the kind of the lead up time to build the services that it needs. So we do have this huge army of people who are probably in the next couple of years going to find it more difficult to get an assessment while we put those resources in place, and while the recommendations of the NHS England ADHD task force, which I was a member of, are hopefully considered and then taken forward into a kind of an improved service that has some level of targets, because some people are waiting 5, 6, 7 years for an assessment, and some people in the UK can't get one. In some areas, particularly borders area of Scotland, some areas in Wales, there's no one to refer to. So you can go to your GP and say, I think I've got ADHD, and you may be told, yeah, I agree, but I have no one I can refer you to.
Okay, let's, if you don't mind, Joe, let's talk about your sort of early life. I touched on it in the intro. Your ADHD journey started as a child. Your GP dismissed you as sort of hyperactive. Assured your mother you'd kind of grow out of it. Just give us a sense of what those early years for you were like.
Alien-esque, I think, would be the best word to describe it. I always felt, and still do, felt like an outsider. In fact, I feel like an outsider amongst our ADHD community. I think it's deeply ingrained in me. And growing up, knowing that I thought differently, felt differently, and I actually presented more like a typical girl with ADHD. I wasn't, whilst I was physically hyperactive, I wasn't behaviourally challenging. I was more anxious and daydreamy and internalised. So my experience was very much just feeling like I was always on the sidelines, like I wasn't a real person until about the age of 27. And that's that's quite late to actually finally feel like you've got your kind of emotional maturity and you can adult at life. Until then, I always felt like I was just watching other people do life well while I struggled to do life kind of adequately, if that makes sense.
I think it must have been incredibly. I'm straying into emotions again, so you'll tell me whether these are inappropriate words to use, but that must have been incredibly painful.
I built a cast iron. I've had lots of therapy in my life, and the most helpful was a form called Internal Family Systems, or IFS. And I worked out that I built what's called a protector, this cast iron kind of coat of protection that didn't let anybody in to my life, because that would stop anybody from rejecting me, stop anybody from telling me the things that I already think about myself. So I built this identity that I am the king of broken promises, that I'm flaky, that I'm unreliable, that I've got nothing to offer to anyone, despite at the same time, in this kind of weird cognitive dissonance, knowing there were some things I was good at, that I was relatively clever, that I was good at biology, that I was occasionally funny. But those early life experiences of just feeling like nobody really understands me and feeling like I'm completely alone have never really left, if that makes sense. So even now, with a wife that's neurodivergent, with an incredible community we built of adults with ADHD or ADHD, I still feel alone.
The joylessness, I'm interested to know whether or not at the other end of the scale, that doesn't you have a cap, if you like, on the positive, but there's no cap on the negative for you.
No, there really isn't. I had a very disappointing appointment with my psychiatrist recently, and we discussed anhedonia, and they wrongly told me that anhedonia is the inability to feel any emotions, which it isn't. If you the Greek or the Latin breakdown, and without hedonia, pleasure. So yeah, I feel the negative things, and I feel them very intensely, particularly kind of anxiety and fear and worry, the types of things that can keep you up at night, particularly with an ADHD brain. So it does feel like you've been dealt with a card with kind of only one suit in there, and three of the suits are missing, so you can't play the full game of cards because you're limited with how you can experience life. And again, that it's something that's consumed me, particularly for the last couple of years, more than my ADHD, more than my other mental health issues, is trying to work out what's the purpose of life if you can't feel joy and pleasure. Is it enough to have meaning? And I've tried to put so much meaning into my life, to start a charity and a podcast and to support other people. But fundamentally, none of that has made me happy. And again, there's lots of shame with that, Andy. When you've helped people, and I get told very often when I'm out doing public talks that the podcast or the charity has helped someone get a diagnosis. And in some cases, people have said, saved my life. I should feel happy. But a friend once said to me, a friend called Eric, that should is could wrapped in shame. And I think that's a really helpful phrase to remember, because I could feel happy, but should puts the emphasis on me. And I'm starting to accept that a bit more, that lack of being able to enjoy other people's kind of successes or stories as well as my own experiences is something I have to learn to reframe.
But meaning is real for you. Are you having to question the meaning of what you do on a regular basis as well?
Not so much the meaning.
Can you feel that?
Well, it's a really interesting question. I can accept that now my life has meaning. In fact, if the worst were to happen today and I had a chance to reflect back on my life, I could say I achieved pretty much everything I ever wanted to. I was very lucky and privileged to have the opportunity to achieve those things. But when it comes to the meaning I have created, it still leaves me empty. It's still, so for example, when we published ADHD Unpacked, I had literally zero emotional connection to the book. I loved writing it. I love writing. If I could just sit and write all day, I would be as happy as I can be. But when it came to the book being out there and people buying it and reviewing it, it was just something that I'd done. And that's a great way of describing anything that I've achieved that has meaning, is to me, it feels like a series of things that I've done, and some people have benefited from them, but it doesn't give me that sense of reward or happiness or joy or pride, which is obviously frustrating. So this endless search for me to try and find what else is there that can keep me going, because at some point, without joy, will I get to a point where I won't want to carry on trying to create meaning because it doesn't give me anything positive in return, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. So, well, I want to make sure I'm understanding it correctly. So it's the fundamental human endeavor, but with rocket boosters and without the positive, joyful moments that most of us are able to have, that at least gives us a bit of perspective, gives us respite, gives us the energy to then go forward. We're on the same path. We're also looking for meaning.
Yeah.
The difficulty for you is that you never get to the platform where you can take a breath even.
No, absolutely.
Is that right?
It is, yeah. I've always had this inability to kind of live in the moment, to stand in front of a beautiful sunset and not think, okay, the car's parked around the corner, we're going to the restaurant in 10 minutes. I really struggle to even kind of look at the small and beautiful things in life. And as I've created more and done more and worked in this field and created a meaning for my life, it's allowed me to accept myself more, which is a positive. It's allowed me to accept my strengths more, which is also a positive, but it has still left me with this, I suppose, yearning and frustration. That one of the best ways I can describe this is I'm a football fan, Andy. I'm a Liverpool fan, and anhedonia is a little bit like being Mo Salah and scoring a 30-yard curling free kick against Manchester United at Old Trafford in the top corner, but nobody sees it, nobody cheers, and you feel nothing when it goes in. It should be incredible. There are things in my life that should just give me that sense of elation and that rush, but it just feels like stuff that I do, and then I move on to the next stuff.
So James, let's just talk a little more then about you as a younger man. I mean, you went on to have an incredible career, which I want to touch on in a second. But before then, life, as you're trying to work out who you are and what all this is for you, how did it sort of manifest itself? How day to day? How was life? I think I'm right in saying that you there was the very difficult moments, brushes with the law, just give us a flavour of what, before you managed to find that kind of track towards academia. What was life like?
It was largely people pleasing. So it was largely trying to fit in with people who I thought, if they accepted me, maybe it would change things. So that did lead me down paths which, real sliding doors moments in my life. I'm very open. Most people that have ever heard me speak know about this. I have a history of substance use, which has gone on for a long time in my life from a very young age. And through activities like that, I can remember stupidly and impulsively and to please people, doing cocaine in a telephone booth with a policeman stood outside it, because I thought that was, this is thrilling and this is cool. It's a ludicrous thing to do. I can remember a friend asking me to help them with a friend who'd had an argument with their boyfriend. So I said, I went round to their house, and he pulled a machete out of the back of his car. And at that point I thought, oh God, what have I agreed to do? But because of my people pleasing, didn't say, I'll walk away at this point, just kind of stood there frozen. And through getting involved with people who were friends or largely acquaintances of friends, had several scraps with the law and arrests and cautions, all based around things that I would not choose to do, that I didn't want to do, but I felt that I had to kind of fit in with the people that I desperately wanted to like me and that I desperately wanted to be like.
So you described it as sliding doors. I mean, your life could at any moment, through any of those extraordinary moments, have taken a completely different path.
Yeah.
Do you credit anyone else with helping you navigate that? Was there, the system wasn't recognizing it, and one might argue still isn't really set up to be able to capture a young person like you at that stage. But were there others around you who were more alive to what was happening and who were making sure that you were making the right decisions at some key points as well as the bad ones?
There weren't really others around me. I had a very close relationship with my brother when I was growing up until I left to originally do nursing. I was a terrible nurse, and luckily I broke my back and had to switch to study biology, and that's another sliding doors moment.
Luckily, I broke my back.
Yeah, I know, but it led me where it led me where I am, Andy. And I was a terrible nurse as a student nurse anyway, but because I didn't have the words to describe my experience, and because the words weren't out there, I couldn't go to someone and talk about my emotional dysregulation, my fear of failure, my inattentiveness, my struggles with just sitting still, because those weren't things that you talked about. It's a typical kind of, we didn't have that in my day era, the kind of the 80s into the 90s. And who was there for me, and this is going to sound slightly trite, were people like David Bowie. Was listening to music from people who clearly understood the experience of being alien, understood the experience of being different. So I took great solace in music, in listening to the Smiths and David Bowie and Suede and bands and artists that sang about just being different, not being the typical male, because that's another thing I've never really identified as being particularly masculine. And growing up in the 80s, lads had to be lads. So I always had to kind of, again, pretend and mirror other people then. So the support that I got was largely, I suppose, succor from musicians and artists who I felt somehow magically knew my experience, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get it. I suspect Kenny Dalglish played his part as well, didn't he?
He did, yeah. And Bruce Grobbelaar's Legs, 1984, never forget that.
So how did you navigate your way towards, well, let's tell the story of the nursing, because that was the first sort of choice for you. So why nursing, I suppose, and tell us the story. What happened? Because that then set you on through the most difficult circumstances, set you on the path towards academia. So just tell us the story, please.
So there's a big thing in ADHD which is called reward. And most of our behaviour is driven by what the brain finds rewarding. And I'm very lucky that I always found biology and health and disease rewarding. So as a child, the one book that I would repeatedly read cover to cover was the Collins Illustrated Encyclopedia of Family Health and Disease. So when I was 7, Andy, I could tell you what a keloid scar was, but I had very few friends. And that kind of love of biology led me to realise I wanted to be a doctor. But because of my challenges with ADHD and the fact that I wasn't at a school that had any level of support for neurodivergent children, I knew I wasn't going to get the academic qualifications needed to do medicine. My sister was a nurse. She was and is incredible at her job. So I thought, well, I'll do nursing. I'll follow my sister into nursing. And I hated it because I wasn't still that 27-year-old person that had found themselves. I was shy, I was anxious, I struggled with talking to patients, I struggled with following instructions, and there were very few mentors for me within nursing training. Now, when I was coming to the end of my nurse training, there was an incident where I was doing a lift with a patient, and I heard a physical pop in my back, and I was bent double, and it turned out it was something called a spondylolisthesis, which is where a part of the spine is kind of fractured or missing. And I was told on that day, you can't nurse anymore because of all the lifting you've got to do. You've got to have your spine fused. And I had to, after that, drive home from Oswestry, where I was working, to Kidderminster, where I lived, in a tiny old Mini with a broken spine. And I had a week before the university year started, and I thought, okay, So I have a couple of rubbish A levels. I have average GCSEs, but I know I'm intelligent. And the nursing college I was studying at was affiliated to the University of Wolverhampton, which I'll forever be grateful to, because their widening participation approach was very much for mature students, or for those students that maybe haven't got the typical route into academia. They'll give you a chance, and they gave me a chance. When I got my degree, I desperately wanted to do a PhD, and I didn't get the opportunities. So I decided to do teacher training, because I thought, well, that's something where I can still learn and use what I know about biology. And I wasn't enjoying that course. And luckily, again, sliding doors moment, halfway through the teacher training program, I got an email from a lecturer at my old university saying, I've got a PhD opportunity if you're interested. And it's very rare. I didn't even get interviewed. I was just given the opportunity. And that allowed me to then learn genuinely how to be a scientist, because doing a PhD is far less about kind of reading and understanding. It's about generating and synthesizing and learning how to do research. So I started off working in the field of body fat and hormones and endocrinology. And this is another way in which I always diminish my experiences, Andy. I'll always say I was always in the right place at the right time. I managed to get a postdoctoral placement at Warwick University, and then I moved to Aston University, and it was at Aston I then became a lecturer. And I kind of found my home, I thought at the time. I found my home because I could do and learn about science. I could teach, because by this point I'd realised that, as odd as it is to maybe have low self-esteem, there is a part of me that's fame hungry and loves standing in front of an audience and just being myself, not a typical lecture, kind of swearing, being honest, being authentic, and students kind of responded to that. So academia allowed me to find myself. But as with most careers, as you rise up the ladder, it changes, the job changes, the admin increases, the expectations increase, the roles that you have increase, and all of a sudden it went from a job where I was enjoying what I was doing to a job where I had to do things that just went against my skill set. And that, as it kind of built and as I took on more and more roles, was kind of what led me to that December moment in 2020, when I felt like if something doesn't change, then I genuinely didn't see a future.
I want to talk about that, obviously, but just one thing that strikes me as you're explaining that sort of career path is that you're told you can't be a nurse anymore. You've broken your back, essentially, your spine. And your immediate reaction in that moment, or I'm sure it wasn't immediate, but pretty swift reaction to that was, okay, I'm going to find another way. And what allowed you to do that was a fundamental self-confidence. So despite all the issues, despite the environment, despite your history, despite these sliding door near misses that you've had in your life, there was always a kind of foundation of self-confidence.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to admit. And for somebody that's self-loathed for many years, for somebody that focuses so much on the negative labels I've got, it's only in the last really 2 to 3 years that I've been able to say things like, actually, I'm quite good at that. I am quite creative. I'm quite intelligent. I can, particularly as I progressed as an academic and became a science communicator and moved into media work, I realised that I could explain complicated science in a way that most people could understand.
Which is a rare skill, rare skill.
Yeah. But for years, mate, it was always, well, right place, right time. I'm not an arsehole, and therefore that's why people hire me, because there's lots of arseholes in academia, and therefore that's why I've got where I've got, rather than at the time being able to say, yeah, I'm good enough to do this. It always felt like, I'll give it a go, I'll apply, or I'll speak to that person, do a bit of networking, and it works out. And it's taken me 20, 25 years to accept that actually, yeah, there was some level of skill and some level of belief in myself to even put myself out there.
It's so interesting because self-confidence would often kind of go hand in hand with happiness, right? And yet for you, you're perfectly capable of feeling self-confident, but incapable of feeling the happiness that should come from confidence.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
There's like a line you can't cross over,
Yeah,
right?
you would think that they're conjoined. That if you
Yeah.
know that you're good at something and you're confident at your ability to do it, that there would be some sense of pleasure in doing that thing. And I think this is where, if I do feel kind of micro positive emotions, it is the process, not the outcome, that I find rewarding. Like I say, writing something, preparing a course, developing something. For me,
Being on stage as a speaker.
yeah, and you know, but even that's diminished. I used to say to my wife, there's only two times I'm happy. That's when I'm on cocaine or when I'm on stage. Now, it's cheaper to be on stage doing public talks, frankly. So I found out that when I started doing public talks, I would be kind of happy on stage. But even over the last 3 years, that's diminished now. So that when I'm on stage, I did a talk last night in front of 240 people, and I'm now being much more emotionally honest. So I'll start by saying, normally I'd say I'm so excited to be here, but I'm not. So instead I'll say I'm clinically indifferent to being here, Lester. It's lovely to see you, I assume. I don't really know. And I use humour.
It's an engaging intro.
Yeah, well,
it's a very engaging intro.
One of my top values is humour. I try and use it, and I'm sure we'll get onto this when it comes to crises as well as everyday life. Using humour to navigate these things helps me navigate these things safely. So yeah, you would think that having that confidence would mean you would be able to take pleasure from the outcome of the thing you're confident in. But for me, the outcome is never important. It's the process, and then once something's done, it's gone. It's disappeared from my mind.
James, Christmas Day 2020. I touched on in the intro a major turning point in deciding that you needed to test for ADHD. Just tell us where you were, tell us what happened, and talk us through what sort of came as subsequently.
So I'm very lucky that I had a long lead in, Andy, in the Alex, my colleague, friend and nemesis, had told me about 5 years earlier. He'd phoned me up and said, I've just been diagnosed with ADHD and you're way more ADHD than I am. And we've realised it may be apocryphal, but he said something like that, and this would have been in around 2015, 2016. And I went online and did all the tests for ADHD, and all the results screamed, you probably have ADHD. But I did nothing with the information, largely because, and this is, again, a wonderful cognitive dissonance, I loathed myself, but I was worried that if I took medication, it would change me, which is such a ridiculous thing to say out loud. So I didn't seek an assessment. I thought, I'm doing okay. But because of the issues with self-monitoring and what we call metacognition, understanding your emotions and behaviours, I wasn't doing okay. I was constantly in burnout. I was struggling with undiagnosed bipolar disorder. I was struggling with undiagnosed ADHD. It was having an impact on my relationship. It was havhaving an impact on my finances. And for many people who are late diagnosed ADHD in the last 5 years, the second lockdown, the winter lockdown in 2020, was very different to the summer one. The summer lockdown for me, when the academic year was kind of over and it was more about, I could spend time in the garden, it was sunny, I could work at my own pace. The winter lockdown was very different. It was overnight changing everything to teaching online. So every lecture had to be rewritten, broken into short chunks, activities had to be created, and it all had to be delivered virtually by a computer screen. So that sense of standing at the front of a room feeling kind of reward, feeling like the showman, that had gone, and it was replaced by spending 12 hours a day sitting in front of a computer screen in a tiny little office at home, talking to a virtual room where nobody's got their cameras on and nobody's speaking, so I've got no idea if they're really listening or not, plus much more admin, longer days. And after the 10th or 11th week of term, so towards kind of mid-December, what happened was when teaching stopped and I had that kind of adrenaline dump, all of a sudden the adrenaline that had been fueling me went. It just hit me like a wall that I had nothing left, that I was in burnout, but more importantly, a lot of the emotions and the thoughts I'd been suppressing really started to surface about the fact that I'm a burden. These are my kind of repeated intrusive thoughts that I'm a burden to my wife, to everybody, that the rest of the world would be better off without me, that I'm always letting people down. And as we got closer to Christmas, and it's always complicated when, as a partnership, we've got two families and we have to try and see both families on Christmas Day, and there's always an element of family politics, and pragmatically we didn't have much money, and things just spiraled from around that second week in December till Christmas Day, when I didn't go to see either family members because I couldn't, and I sat there in silence staring at the wall in what we would call active ideation. So not thinking you're a burden, you're a failure, thinking, right, okay, how are we going to do this? And that was the first time that I had really active suicidal ideation. And luckily at that time, the people that I knew that had ADHD, Alex and a friend of mine called Eric, who I'd helped get a diagnosis before me, typical ADHD people pleasing, they were speaking to me, and my wife Sam was speaking to me saying, you need help. So it was at that point, on that Christmas Day, that I realised, okay, I'm going to get help. And that's a big thing, Andy, to go from I don't deserve help, I'm a burden, to actually I deserve help and I want to have a future. And that switch from there's no future to I'm just going to explore if there is one was massive. Now at the time, I knew that there were long waits for ADHD assessments on the NHS, and I was so desperate that I went to the bank of Mum and said, Mum, is there any chance you can help me get a private diagnosis, which at the time collectively, if you include the assessment and the medication, probably cost about £1,500, £1,800. But it meant that within 3 weeks I was of looking into this, I was diagnosed, and within 3 months I was medicated. And I think it's fair to say that has probably been the most transformational thing that's ever happened to me, is getting that diagnosis. The medication that has really helped, but more importantly, settling after years what my identity was. That all of those labels, and people often don't like the label of ADHD, but I tell you what, it is better than the labels we give ourselves internally of flaky and unreliable and lazy and thick and stupid, and understanding that I could actually look at all the failed relationships, or the decade in my 20s when I didn't engage in relationships through fear of rejection. I could view all of that through this lens of, there's a reason for that, there's a reason I do these things, and that allowed me to accept myself. At the same time, because I'd also worked out I probably had bipolar, I sought a bipolar assessment. That took a bit longer because it was on the NHS, and a year later I was diagnosed with cyclothymia, and mood disorders like bipolar are much more common in the ADHD population. So that year of getting my ADHD diagnosis through to the year later getting my cyclothymia diagnosis is kind of a definitive year in my life.
Were there different feelings about each of those diagnosis for you? I mean, the ADHD, you'd had people telling you that they believed that was kind of part of a fundamental part of who you are. The second diagnosis, though, was it more of a shock? Was it a...
No, it's a really interesting question, actually, because many people report when they get their diagnosis of ADHD that they feel like they tricked the psychiatrist, that they come out still feeling a bit like a fraud because there isn't an objective test. And particularly for adults, there isn't a blood test or a brain scan or a computer test that can say, yes, that person objectively has ADHD. The tests rely on your recollection of symptoms and how often they happen and the impact they have on your life. Before my ADHD assessment, knew I had ADHD. I didn't have a doubt in the world that I would be diagnosed. And it was the same with bipolar. In fact, I had to fight for the bipolar diagnosis because for years I'd thought my mental health could be described as neutral or numb most of the time, and then every so often something would just push me down into despair. Like I say, 2 or 3 times a year, just a bit of extra pressure or something someone says, and all of a sudden I'm in despair. What I hadn't spotted were the hypomanic episodes, because they were often masked by drug taking, by the silly and reckless activities which we've talked about. And it was only when I watched the television program Brassic, in which the lead character is bipolar, and watching that thought, oh my God, I could have a bipolar disorder. And through watching that and then doing some reading, I realised that previous pattern of thinking that I was always kind of numb or neutral with occasional lows, no, there were hypomanic episodes as well. There were times when I would, stay up for 4 days, even without taking drugs, rabbit holing on the internet and really becoming separated from reality. So I also kind of knew I had bipolar and had some resistance with getting a diagnosis. And I understand this, that it's challenging for clinicians when somebody comes in saying, I think I've got this and here's the reasons why. And I even kind of had written down the diagnostic criteria and how I met them all. And in the end, the reason I had to wait a year was because the first psychiatrist kind of just didn't do anything. Gave me the lowest dose of a tablet commonly used for bipolar, but at a non-therapeutic level. And then after 3 months, I contacted my GP and said, am I raising the dose? What's happening? And they said, we don't know, you've been discharged. So I had to measure my mood every day for a year and keep a spreadsheet. So I could then show them and say, look, here are the dips, here are the highs. And then based on that, they said, kind of as I expected, yeah, you've got cyclothymia. So I've always been, I think because of my medical knowledge, lucky enough to kind of know, if something is the case, and to really just want to seek the professional legitimization of what I already suspect.
James, I'm interested to know how you're sort of spinning the plates at this point, because your career is, your career is a successful one. It's a sophisticated one. It's a complex one. As an academic, you're not just buried in the work. You're also, you're lecturing, you're teaching, you're surrounded by others continually. How were you managing to be such a sort of high performer, if you like, whilst this complexity of who you are, why am I here, what's my life all about, and now at this stage in the story, your recognition of the ADHD diagnosis, but still a struggle to fully understand it. How did those two things sort of run in parallel?
The two ways I did it
in practical terms.
Yeah, in practical terms, the two ways that I was able to have that success. One was a simple magic trick: is look over here, don't look over here. Look at the things that are going well. Make sure that people I work with are aware of the things that are going well. At that point, I had 5 senior roles. I was admissions tutor for the school I was in. I was associate dean for science communication. I was director of an Asian research centre. I was head of physiology. I was also teaching, doing my own research, supervising PhD students, master's students, etc. And looking back, what I would often do is the stuff that was falling to pieces was kind of hide it as much as I could. So if there were activities in one of those areas of my job which I knew weren't going well, it would be to kind of hide them, to cover them up a little bit, because I knew I was failing. And what that meant is that most people on the surface thought, yeah, no, he's a rising star, he's doing all these things. But if you looked at granular detail, you'd say, yeah, but he's not doing so well at those 3 roles. We haven't hit our admissions numbers, or we haven't managed to organise a conference for the Aging Research Centre yet. And the other thing that allowed me to have that success was the fact that it came at my expense. That keeping all those plates spinning, keeping all of the people that had given me responsibility happy, came at the expense of my physical health, my mental health, and my relationship. So I would, this is a cover your ears anecdote, I was such a people pleaser, Andy, that early on in my career, my wife and I were enjoying a moment of physical intimacy, let's put it that way, and my boss from university called, and I answered the call. I disengaged with what should be, let's talk about prioritization, the important thing I was doing, to say, hi boss, how are things? What do you need me for? I was just so desperate for people to think that I was good, but not the right people, not my wife, not my friends. It was the people that I worked with. And therefore, the success that I had came from almost like hiding the things that I struggled with, masking a lot, but also just burning myself out mentally and physically, and repeatedly putting my relationship at stress.
So, I mean, the anecdote you gave us there is a clear demonstration of how one should not kind of live one's life, I suppose. But there are also, in and amongst all that, there are also positives, right? And I suppose if someone's listening to this, wondering about themselves, or maybe someone who's either self-diagnosed or been diagnosed, and trying to work out how's my life, how should I manage, my life going forward. You don't look at the number of plates that you were spinning. Yes, perhaps some of them, not as successful as you'd like, but you were and are unbelievably productive individual. That's a positive, isn't it? And are you able to still extract that out of the complexity of your diagnosis and the difficulties of it, but still say, yeah, and that's a lesson that kind of comes out of a lot of the conversations that we have on this podcast, is to, I suppose it's a version of opportunity in crisis at its kind of least subtle.
It's an interesting thing. I mean, the whole subject of crisis is interesting because anecdotally, you'll hear this from so many people with ADHD, we're better in a crisis. Because the absolute kind of temporal, it needs to be done now pressure of a crisis tends to cut through a lot of the noise that's going on inside an ADHD brain. So we generally tend to, in the short term, do well in a crisis. It's why many people with ADHD work in the emergency services and are incredible at their jobs. But the broader trying to manage those crises for a long time is what then becomes damaging. But within that, yeah, you're absolutely right. There are things that I can look at and say that I did well, and there are things that I can look at and say that I learned from. And in terms of kind of people understanding themselves, what's really important when it comes to ADHD in particular is we all have strengths. Everybody has strengths, and you'll often hear ADHD described as a superpower, and it's not for everybody. It really isn't. And there are strengths often ascribed to ADHD or assigned to ADHD that they're not universal, but it often comes down to the balance of strengths and challenges. And if your challenges outweigh your personal strengths, it feels like a struggle. So what I was able to do was to focus on the things that I knew I was good at. So moving into science communication and doing more media work allowed me to do stuff that gave me more confidence, and I could use that confidence to then take forward into future activities. But at the same time, motivation's a big thing, again, in ADHD, Andy, and many people with ADHD have what we call amotivation or less internal motivation. It's why we tend to respond well to deadlines or external kind of motivation rather than saying to ourselves, okay, I'll do that thing next Friday. And my motivation was often fear. And the best example I can give of this is emails. So when I was an academic, I'd get probably 200 emails a day and I'd answer every single one because my motivation was fear. If I don't answer those emails, people will think that I'm lazy or slow, or I'm slowing things up. Now, when I left academia and now I work kind of for my own company, if I answer 10 emails a day, then I've done well, because whilst I value those emails far more, I don't have the fear to motivate me. And therefore trying to motivate myself to do something as simple as open my inbox and answer emails is challenging. And that speaks to something that's really important to acknowledge in ADHD, that we can be incredibly productive, but ADHD is a performance issue, not an ability issue. And what it often manifests as is consistent inconsistency. So that means on a Monday, I can be super productive, can do what might be 18 hours of work in 6 hours, and then on Tuesday, sometimes I can't even open my inbox and just kind of sit there staring at the screen and can't do anything. And over the kind of the longer term, that balances out into being a productive person. But again, it comes at a cost, because good days are the enemy of bad days. And when it is a day when you don't feel as productive or you're less able to engage with work, you forget that you had those good days, or you could do it yesterday. And instead of kind of focusing on the fact that you'll probably be able to do it again tomorrow, you think, well, why can't I do it today? Yesterday I was absolutely on the ball and I was smashing out emails, and I wrote 3,000 words for the book, and today I'm staring at a blank page. So a lot of the kind of success and progress and stuff that I achieved and the productivity I still have is accepting that I have to work in fits and starts. And when it's my time to work, sorry, particularly early in the morning, if I can get up at 4, I can work from 4 until 10 and get a full day's work done and feel accomplished. And other days, it just doesn't happen.
Do you have concerns, James? We touched on it briefly earlier, but do you have concerns that your mission is being undermined by those who, I suppose, undermine your work? There are those who adopt and leverage ADHD without evidence of an accurate diagnosis. How do you feel about that, and how do you sort of measure the impact for those sort of genuinely living with ADHD?
I think this is a really sensitive area and a complicated area. My approach, and the approach that a kind of charity and community has, is no diagnosis. Say that again. The approach that I've always taken, and our kind of podcast and charity and community take, is no diagnosis necessary. Because it can take so long to get a diagnosis, we want to be able to support people who suspect they've got ADHD. But there are always going to be people for whom it is more of an excuse than a reason, if that makes sense. Now, ADHD is a reason for things happening, but it's never an excuse. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. And whilst the vast, vast majority of people who self-diagnose or self-identify as having ADHD probably do, there are going to be some people who either don't fully understand what ADHD is, but it fits in with some of the issues they've had, or have other issues which can present like ADHD, whether it's anxiety, bipolar, the awfully named borderline personality disorder, perimenopause and menopause. Lots of other life events and health conditions can look like ADHD. It is a complicated field. I suspect that the people, the individuals that are using this massive increase in awareness and understanding and people seeking help for ADHD, the individuals and organisations I'm more worried about are the snake oil merchants, are the adverts you'll see on Instagram, for example, dopamine patches. This patch will improve your focus. Literally will do nothing. There's no evidence that that dopamine will get across the skin, and then dopamine can't get to the brain when it's in the blood. So products and services are the things that I'm more worried about, that it's become a money-making machine, because you've got this huge army of people who can't yet get medication because they can't yet get an assessment, but are desperate for something to help them focus, to help them, control their emotions, to help them be a bit less impulsive. And there's not much good information out there, which is why we started the charity and the podcast, to share evidence-based information so people wouldn't have to turn to expensive supplements that do nothing, or to apps that cost a lot of money and are probably too difficult to use. So there are always going to be some people who will jump on a bandwagon. This is probably the worst bandwagon to jump on because it's been rolling for thousands of years. It takes about 5 years to get on it, and all you get is some really weak speed when you get on there. But there are always going to be some people that will want to jump on that bandwagon. And I think that at the minute, they aren't having as much of a negative impact as the positive impact we're having from more conversations about ADHD being had.
What strikes me about your story, though, and your approach and your mission, James, is that what you haven't, and this comes across, I think, in the conversation that we've had so far, is that you're not at any point has there been, a scintilla of self-pity, and not at any point has there been a kind of, a kind of shelving of personal responsibility in it. And that, I think, is where there is an area of concern for some, not just with ADHD, but with, the thank God, much, kind of more active conversation that we're having around neurodivergence, is the idea that where does responsibility sit in the middle of it? So I'm interested to ask, where do you think it sits? Because your work suggests that it's a very important part of it, but maybe I've got that wrong.
No, it is. I think particularly when it comes to ADHD, the other neurodivergences are slightly differently nuanced, let's put it that way. When it comes to taking responsibility, when it comes to self-pity, when it comes to self-acceptance, a lot of those measures really come down to understanding what ADHD is. I did an interview, I think it was with Times Radio a couple of years ago, and I was asked, with ADHD, are we not just pathologizing a lack of resilience in people? And I was really offended by that, because it doesn't understand the lived experience of ADHD. Nobody wants to do the things that we struggle to do more than people with ADHD. Believe me, nobody wants to be able to sit still in that meeting for 3 hours and take notes and not mind wander. Nobody wants to be able to hand in that piece of university coursework on time more than people with ADHD. But the executive function, these high-level thinking skills like organisation, planning, prioritisation, they're all a key part of ADHD. Those challenges make it harder. So when it comes to responsibility, I think responsibility for your actions, as long as you understand ADHD, is something that we can and should or could accept from time to time, as long as we're also willing to accept that sometimes acting impulsively, making careless mistakes that impact other people, having an emotional outburst which fully wasn't under our control, that's not our fault. So it's this mixture of responsibility and acceptance that allows people to get to a point where you can live with ADHD and accept the ebbs and flows and the ups and downs and the things you don't like and the things you do like, with a little bit more self-compassion.
Yeah. That's it, isn't it? Really, is how do we strike that balance between those two things? Can I ask you about prisons? Something that I have an interest in. I've heard you say before that prisons are a hotbed for undiagnosed ADHD.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure you're aware, but this podcast actually is in partnership with the Ministry of Justice, and therefore these conversations are listened to by, inmates sat in their cell as they're pondering their future and pondering themselves. So I guess I'd sort of invite you to speak directly to those people who might be listening now, sat in a cell, wondering, listening to you, whether or not they have ADHD. What would you say to them?
I think the first thing I'd say is that I'm sorry. I'm sorry that society's failed you. And that fundamentally, for many neurodivergent people involved in the criminal justice system, is a statement of fact. If you look at, there are different measures of how many people in the prison system kind of likely have ADHD. The most recent analyses suggest something like 30 to 33% of male prisoners in the prison population have sufficient symptoms of ADHD to warrant a diagnosis. So in the general population, between 3 and 5%, in the prison population, a third, roughly 33%. And it kind of makes sense when you look at how ADHD presents when we're young, as being impulsive, being reckless, not considering the outcomes of our actions, being more likely to get involved in substances. I was using substances when I was 14, again, partly because the way in which the reward centre of the brain combined with impulsivity means we're more likely to engage in substances as well as other activities which can lead you down that path. And we also know that there are differences in the different groups that have ADHD and how they are supported when they're young. So we generally know, for example, that African Caribbean boys are more likely to be sent down the kind of social services route rather than the special educational needs route, or have been in the past, certainly. Mm-hmm. So to people who are in the criminal justice system who suspect they've got ADHD, it's an apology on behalf of society. The whole reason I do what I do and share everything about myself is because I genuinely hope that one day there'll be a generation where none of this will have to happen, where people won't have to go through the experiences I've been through. But for people who've ended up with their entire life being changed, and when I think back to those sliding doors moments in my life, of walking into a club with sufficient amount of drugs that it definitely would have been seen as intent to supply, even though it wasn't, that would have been my life gone. I wouldn't be here today. And there are many people who've had those sliding doors moments, or who've had those opportunities sometimes to do something else. But when you've got a brain that directs you in a certain way, to follow the rewards, to follow the dopamine, to people please, to fit in, it means that lots of people have ended up in a situation where their life has been irrevocably changed by the fact that when they were younger, there was no support for assessment, for diagnosis of ADHD.
So if I were to boil it down, which is far too simplistic approach, because I know that you've got views on so many different aspects of this and are doing important work across so many different areas. But if there were three things, you're put in charge, James, of whatever, and you get a week to make a difference on three things. What would you focus on? What are the three priorities for you that might get us to a point where you can prevent that lad ending up, sat in a cell?
So first of all, we need root and branch change in the education system. And that means that the way in which young people are identified as potentially being neurodivergent and then provided with assessments and diagnosis needs to change. There's this weird little rule in ADHD diagnosis, which is that the symptoms have to have a moderate impact on at least two domains of your life. Now, as an adult, that can be work, relationships, finance, kind of home. Now, as a child, almost universally, it's considered that a child only has two domains, home and school. And that's not true, because you've got sleep, you've got socialization, you've got self-care. And what often happens is that children that have a home report that says, yes, very ADHD, hard to control, hard to focus, but at school in a structured environment, you get a report that says, no, they turn up, they're not disruptive, can't see any problems. That means lots of children don't get diagnosed. So we need to change the education system so that we have a better understanding of the variety of ways in which ADHD presents. If we had that, we know that the outcomes for children who are diagnosed and medicated are better in every single domain, apart from with medication slightly reduced stature by 1 to 2 inches. Everything else, educational attainment, employment, relationships, mental health, substance use, all of that's improved if children are diagnosed and medicated. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I think is specific to the prison system or criminal justice system is educating people that work in the criminal justice system. And there are great organisations like the ADHD Alliance, a friend of mine, Daley Jones, runs that, who are trying to not just support officers who have ADHD, but to educate people in a custody suite about how, having an appropriate adult is needed. About how simple things, because of sensory processing issues. So, for example, I can't wear sleeves on my wrists because if anything touched my wrists, I find it distressing. Now, if somebody were to grab my wrists, I would lash out because it's an instant reaction. And you can imagine in a custody suite situation that you might grab somebody's wrist if you want to maneuver them in a position. So better education for people in various areas of the criminal justice system so that they understand that some of the behaviours that they see aren't chosen, aren't naturally oppositional, they're driven by our brains. And the third thing really comes down to how we fund, in all aspects of society, support for ADHD. At the minute, there are only really two treatment options: medication, and that's successful in about 80% of people, and therapy, and that's less successful. Now, again, coming back to the prison argument, I can't remember that the cost of keeping somebody in prison is £80,000, £100,000 a year, something like that. The cheapest medication for ADHD in its cheapest form, which is generic methylphenidate, 10 milligrams, is about £2.60 a month. And therefore, if you think about the cost of actually adequately assessing and diagnosing ADHD, not just in the prison population, when for the NHS England ADHD Task Force we submitted our interim report to the government, we identified, and this is evidence-based information, that the cost of not adequately assessing, treating and diagnosing ADHD is £19 billion per year to the economy. £19 billion. And if you think how the government is currently trying to save money through various different means for far smaller amounts than that. The frustration that we know that if there is adequate resource put into this, it won't just improve the finances of the country, it will change lives, it will transform lives, it will give people lives that they otherwise will not be allowed to lead. So we need education to change, particularly within the prison system, about what ADHD really is, but we also need to look at how we are funding and giving people access to not just assessment, but follow-on support when it comes to medication and other supports as well.
Super. I asked you this question in the context of a lad sat in or a woman sat in a prison cell. Let me just finish then by asking the question of someone who's just living their life, struggling, and wondering, having listened to this podcast, the single clearest piece of advice that you give them would be.
Pragmatically, if you're kind of thinking, the single biggest piece of advice is to search on the internet for the ASRS test. It's the Adult ADHD Self-Report Scale. It's 90% predictive at showing if somebody has sufficient symptoms for a diagnosis. If that test is positive, go and see your GP. And if you're registered at a GP practice in England, asked to be referred via Right to Choose to, there are a whole series of contracted qualified providers where you can actually get a faster assessment than through your NHS services. But it starts with that. If you want to have a diagnosis, and for some people they don't, but if you want to have a diagnosis, either because it allows you to access medication, it gives you legal protection at workplace, that first step is do that online test and then go and see your GP and ask for a referral.
Super. James, thanks so much for this conversation. We really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure, mate.
It's an area that we've been wanting to talk about for a little while, and I think we found the perfect person to help us try and navigate all this. So thanks for sharing your story. Thanks for your wisdom. It's really appreciated.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Crisis What Crisis is a podcast really that's all about coming back from the brink to a place of strength. So if you know someone who needs that, please do share it. As always, full transcripts along with helpful links are available on our website. Just head to crisiswhatcrisis.com. Thanks as ever to the Crisis What Crisis team. Jane Sankey, Hannah Walker-Brown, Rex Fisher, Mabel Pickering and the brilliant people at Global. And thank you so much for listening.